All right, Mr. Trutna here. This is we're on Unit 7. This is worksheet number 1. We're going to be going over the Pythagorean Theorem and maybe even the converse of the Pythagorean Theorem. So you notice that the directions say, let me zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. It says find the value of x, and then we're going to round our answer to the nearest tenth. Okay, so remember, if you have a right triangle, and if you are given two values for two of the three sides of the right triangle, and you're trying to find one of the missing sides of the right triangle, that's going to be Pythagorean theorem. Okay, so what I do when I do Pythagorean theorem is I always highlight which side is the hypotenuse right there, and and the reason why I do that is because the hypotenuse is going to be the side that's going to be most important. Pythagorean theorem says that if you take one of the legs squared, we call that A. You add it to another of the legs of the right triangle squared, we call that B. It's going to be equal to the hypotenuse, which we call C squared. So A squared plus B squared equal to C squared. Where A and B are the legs, 10 and 7, so you could put 10 in for A and 7 in for B, or you could do it the other way around, it doesn't matter, is going to be equal to C, which is the hypotenuse, which is x squared. Okay? So substituting these values in, we get 10 squared plus 7 squared equals x squared, and then we solve it for x. So we're going to square both numbers, so 10 squared, or 10 to the second power, is 100, because that means 10 times 10, plus 7 to the second power is 49. That's going to be equal to x squared. You add up the 100 and the 49 to get 149. That's going to be equal to x squared, and then your last step would be to solve for x. And the way that you undo a second power is you're going to square root both sides of the equation. Okay? And when you square root a second power, the second power cancels out the square root. That would leave us with the variable x, and it would be equal to whatever the square root of 149 is. Okay, so here's my calculator, and you can see that, hopefully you can see that the square root of 149 is equal to this rather lengthy decimal. Let me turn on the light here so maybe we can see it a little bit better without the glare. Let's find a spot where there's no glare. There we go. And it's 12.2. All right, so that would be my answer to x. So number 1, x is going to be equal to 12.2. Moving on to number 2, notice we have a right triangle. We are given values for two of the three sides of the right triangle. So when that happens, that means that you're going to use Pythagorean theorem. Okay, a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. And I think it's a good idea to always highlight or denote which side is the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is always going to be the longest side, and the longest side is always across from the 90-degree angle. So 21 is the hypotenuse. Okay, so I'm going to go a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. C is the hypotenuse, which is 21, so we're going to substitute C, 21 in for C. And then x and 19 are your a and your b value. And it doesn't matter which one's a and which one's b. So I'm going to substitute x in for a and get x squared. I'm going to substitute 19 in for b. So I'm going to get x squared plus 19 squared equals 21. And now I'm going to simplify this equation and solve it. You can't simplify x squared. 19 to the second power you can simplify, and that is 361, and that's going to be equal to 21 to the second power, which is equal to 441. Okay, my next step would be I would subtract 361 from each side of the equation. Those 361s would cancel out, and now my equation would become x squared is equal to 441 minus 361 is 80. Okay, now to solve for x, if you have an x squared, once again what we do is we're going to take the square root. And if we take the square root of one side of the equation, we have to take the square root of the other side of the equation. The second power would cancel out that square root symbol, or the radical symbol, so we would get x is equal to the square root of 80, and the square root of 80, according to this calculator, and I switch calculators on you, is equal to that rather lengthy decimal. Okay, well the instructions said round to the nearest tenth, So that 9 is in the 10th spot, and the 4 doesn't change to 9, so 8.9. So in number 2, x is equal to 8.9. Okay, number 3, same idea. Notice in number 3 we have a right triangle as denoted by the 90-degree mark, and we are given values of 2 of the sides. Okay, so I'm going to use Pythagorean theorem. My hypotenuse would be 27. The hypotenuse is always your c value in Pythagorean theorem. So to solve this out, I would go x squared plus 16 squared. Those are my two legs. That's my a and my b value. And then my c value, the hypotenuse, is 27 squared. Okay, we're going to simplify and solve. So 16 to the second power is 256. So we get x to the second plus 256 is equal to 27 to the second power is equal to 729. Subtract 256 from each side of the equation. The 256's would cancel out. X to the second power is equal to 729 minus 256 is 473. And then you would take the square root of both sides of the equation. Okay, that second power would cancel out the radical symbol. We would get x is equal to the square root of 473, and using a calculator, the square root of 473 is 21.74, and we're going to round that to 21.7. We're rounding to the 10th. So number 3, x is equal to 21.7. All right, number 4, same idea. We're using Pythagorean theorem in number 4. So let's denote which side is the hypotenuse. So here's my 90-degree angle. The hypotenuse is always the longest side in a right triangle, and the longest side is always opposite the 90-degree angle. So that's your c value. So when I set up Pythagorean theorem, my a squared plus b squared equals c squared, my c value is going to be x squared. Okay, and then a and b could be either one of these two numbers. So 5.3 squared plus 12.8 squared, the other leg, and that's going to be equal to x squared. Okay, so I simplify. So 5.83 squared is 28.09 plus 12.8 squared, 12.8 to the second power is 163.84. That's going to be equal to x squared. Add these two values up, so 163.84 added to 28.09, that gives me 191.93, and that's going to be equal to x squared. And now to solve for x, when you have an x squared, you take the square root of both sides of the equation. Okay, once again, that second power would cancel out the radical symbol, so we would get x is equal to whatever the square root of 191.93 is. So using the calculator again, square root of 191.93, we get 13.85. We're going to round that to 13.9. Number 4, x is equal to 13.9. All right, moving on. Number 5. So as you can see in number 5, what we have going on is we are starting, we want to find the value of x, and we are starting with a big triangle here which has two equal sides, so this is an isosceles triangle. Okay, so, and then we have this altitude going down the middle of the isosceles triangle. So an altitude always makes a 90-degree angle, and then it's going to bisect at 18. So that means this bottom part is going to be 9. Okay, now that's going to be important because now, maybe you see it, but I'll highlight it for you. This triangle right here, I'm now going to work with that right triangle. And I'm going to use Pythagorean theorem using the right triangle with a leg of 9, a leg of 20, and a hypotenuse of x. Okay, so this is the triangle, so there's my hypotenuse. So I'm going to do a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, where 9 and 20 are your legs, so I'm going to go 9 squared plus 20 squared. That's going to be equal to the hypotenuse, which is x squared. So number 5 is no different than numbers 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. It's just that you had to decipher the information a little bit. Okay, 9 to the second power is 81. 20 to the second power simplifies to 400. I add those two values up, I get 481 is equal to x to the second power, and then I'm going to take the square root of both sides of the equation. Once again, that second power would cancel out the radical symbol, leaving me with just x, so x would be equal to the square root of 481, and you can see that turns out to be, hopefully you can see that, nope, you can't see that, now you can see it, that turns out to be 21.93, and just rounded to the 10th, that'd be 21.9. So there's your answer to number 5, 21.9. Okay, number 6. Now in number 6, the idea of number 6 is, there we go, you can now see it, we're going to find the value of x, and x represents this side right here of the top of a trapezoid, so I have a trapezoid. Okay, well, if you notice, and hopefully you do, and if you don't, I'm going to highlight it, this trapezoid is divided into two right triangles right here, and right here, and those two right triangles are identical. They're congruent to one another. Okay, so the idea of this problem is that before you can find x, you need to first find out how long the bottom leg is of both of these right triangles. And you really don't need to find both of them. I'm going to call those y. You really don't have to need to find both of them. Once you find one, you will know the other because they're congruent. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, let's focus in on this right triangle right here. Notice that leg is 17, that leg is y. The hypotenuse has a congruent mark, which is the same as that congruent mark, so that means the hypotenuse is 19. So using this triangle right here, I'm going to do Pythagorean Theorem. So leg squared, which would be y squared, plus the other leg, which is 17 squared, that's going to be equal to the hypotenuse, and the hypotenuse is 19 squared. So that's my equation I'm going to use to find both of those two values right there. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So 17 to the second power becomes 289. So I'm going to get y squared plus 289 is equal to, and 19 squared, or 19 to the second power, you could say it either way, is equal to 361. To solve for y squared, I'm going to subtract 289 from both sides of the equation. 361 minus 289 is equal to 72. So now I'm going to get y to the second power is equal to 72. And now to solve for y, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So the second power cancels out the radical, and y turns out to be the square root of 72. And the square root of 72 is equal to, square root 72 is equal to, and I'm going to round it to the 10th to 8.5. So there's the square root of 72. There's y. Okay, now how is that helpful? Well, if you notice now, that part is 8.5, as is that part. And if you notice, this middle part is what's left over of whatever this is. And notice this 31, here's where the 31 comes into play. The entire bottom is 31. So I'm going to add up to 8.5 into 8.5. I'll do it over here off to the side. That gives me 17. 8.5 plus 8.5. Then I'm going to subtract that, 17, from 31. So that's 14. So that tells me this middle part right here is 14, which is the same as the x part. So therefore, number 6, x has to be 14. Hopefully that made sense. Number 7. So in number 7, we are finding the value of x. And if you notice, x is the hypotenuse, but x is the hypotenuse for this right triangle on the right side of the equation, right here. Okay? And of that triangle that I just highlighted, since the entire top of this shape, or the length of it is 44, and this part is 16, 44 take away 16 is equal to 28, so this has to be 28. So now let's look at this highlighted triangle. It's a right triangle. That side's 28, that side's x. I don't know that side. So what I have to do is, I have to jump over to the right triangle on the left. And this angle right here has to be 90 degrees. And it has to be 90 degrees because it's adjacent with that angle. Okay, so this triangle right here, which I'm outlining in silver or gray, I'm not too sure what color it is, what I have to do is I have to use Pythagorean theorem, and I have to find this side right here, which I'll call y. Okay, so I'm going to use y, which is a leg, 16, which is a leg, and 22, which is the hypotenuse, and I'm going to use Pythagorean theorem. Y squared plus 16 squared is equal to 22 squared, and I'm going to find that value. Then once I have that value, then I'm going to jump over to this highlighted triangle, and I'm going to use Pythagorean theorem again in order to find x. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So let's work it out. So simplifying, 16 to the second power is 256. So y to the second plus 256. 22 squared, or 22 to the second power, you can say it either way, is 484. I'm going to subtract 256 from both sides of the equation. That would cancel out to 256, and my new equation would be y to the second is 484 minus 256 is 228. And then to solve for y, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, and that's called the radical symbol right there. Square root, radical symbol. Okay, this second power would cancel out that radical symbol. That's why I get y, and that's equal to whatever the square root of 228 is. And the square root of 228, as we're about to find out, is, and I'm going to round this answer to the 10th, and that is going to round to 15.1. Okay, so that's what my y value is going to be, 15.1. So that means that side right there is 15.1. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to this highlighted right triangle. I'm going to use 15.1, which is a leg, 28, which is a leg, and x, which is the hypotenuse, and I'm going to use Pythagorean theorem to solve for x. So that means that 15.1 squared plus 28 squared is going to be equal to x squared. Okay, so once I get to this point, now I'm going to simplify. So 15.1 to the second power is 228.01 plus 28 to the second power is 784. I'm going to add those two values up, and those two values are going to be equal to x squared. So 784 plus 228.01 gives me 1012.01, so 1012.01. And now if x squared is equal to this, to find the value of x, I take the square root of both sides. And remember that square root symbol is called the radical symbol. So that second power cancels out the radical symbol, and I'm going to get x is equal to the square root of 1012.01. So the square root, pull it down so you can see it, of 1012.01, and I'm going to round my answer to the 10th, so 31.8. So there's my answer to number 7. Okay, that was a pretty detailed problem, but I like those. I think 5, 6, and 7 were probably great problems to do. All right, number 8, let's read the problem. So when you're getting a problem like number 8, first of all, the first thing you want to do is you want to read the problem. The second thing you want to do is you want to draw a picture of what the problem's describing, and then you're going to set up Pythagorean theorem. So Scott is using a 12-foot ramp to help load furniture into the back of a moving truck. If the back of the truck is 3.5 feet from the ground, what is the horizontal distance from where the ramp reaches the ground to the truck? Okay, so I'm going to use this line as the ground. So what we have is we have a ramp going up, and the ramp is going up essentially to the back of a truck. And here's the back of the truck right here. I'm going to use my amazing artistic abilities right here to just wow you. So there's my truck. It's a U-Haul. There we go. So Scott is using a 12-foot ramp. So how long is the ramp? 12 feet. Okay, it's moving it into the back of a moving truck. The back of the truck, so here's my back of my truck, is 3.5 feet from the ground. So that means that distance right there is 3.5 feet. what is the horizontal distance from where the ramp reaches the ground to the truck? So this distance right here is what we want to find. So that's my x. So notice we have a right triangle. We have an x, which is a leg. We have a 3.5, which is a leg. And then we have a 12, which is the hypotenuse. So this is a Pythagorean Theorem problem. So leg a squared, which would be x squared, that's one of the legs, plus the other leg b squared, 3.5 squared, is going to be equal to c squared. C is the hypotenuse, 12 squared. So to solve this, there's my problem. Let's simplify it. X squared stays x squared, plus 3.5 squared is 12.25. That's going to be equal to 144. Now we're going to solve for x, so we're going to subtract 12.25 from each side of the equation. 144 minus 12.25 is going to turn out to be 141.75. So x squared is equal to 141.75. And then to find the value of x, I would take the square root of both sides of the equation. On the side where the x is, that second power cancels out that radical symbol. You could call it the square root symbol if you wanted to. So x is going to be equal to the square root of 141.75. And I'm going to round my answer to the nearest tenth value. So 11.9. So there we go. There's number 8. Okay, flipping the page over, 9 and 10 on the back side. Number 9 is a word problem. Let's read it, then let's draw a picture. So a 30-foot wire is secured to the top of a flagpole to a stake in the ground. If the stake is 14 feet from the base of the flagpole, how tall is the flagpole? Okay, so let's draw this. So here's my flagpole. The flagpole is into the ground. I'm going to use the bottom right there as that's going to be the ground. Here's my flagpole. Okay, so a 35-foot wire is secured, so from the top of the flagpole, which is right there, to a stake in the ground. So there's a wire that basically goes like this, okay, into the ground. And that is 35 feet. Okay, if the stake, so there's my stake, is 14 feet from the base of the flagpole, so that means the bottom right here, from here to here, is 14 feet. How tall is the flagpole? So that's going to be my x. Okay, so you can see I just created a right triangle. I know two sides of the right triangle, and 35 is my hypotenuse, so I'm going to use Pythagorean Theorem. I'm going to take one of the legs, x squared, plus the other leg, 14 squared, and that's going to be equal to the hypotenuse squared. So x squared plus 14 squared equals 35 squared. Let's solve it. Okay, simplifying, 14 squared is 196. So I get x squared plus 196 is equal to, and 35 squared is 1,225. Subtracting 196 from both sides of the equation, my new equation becomes x squared is equal to 1,225 minus 196 is 1,029. And then to find x, which would represent the height of the flagpole, or how tall the flagpole is, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, that second power canceled out that radical symbol. X is equal to whatever the square root of 1,029 is, and clear my calculator out, and the square root of 1,029, and I'm going to round my answer here, 32.1. So there we go, feet. So that's how tall the flagpole is. Okay, last one that you were assigned was number 10. Number 10, it says if the diagonal of a square is 11.3 meters, approximately what is the perimeter of the square? Okay, so we have a square, so let's draw a square here. And then let's draw a diagonal of the square, and let's mark the diagonal as 11.3. So there's my diagonal, and it's marked as 11.3. Okay, and then remember what we want to find is we want to find the perimeter of the square. So how do you find the perimeter of the square? Remember, to find the perimeter of the square, you're going to take every single side and you're going to add them up. But the problem is, I don't know how long the sides are, so I'm going to call that side x. Which, by the way, since it's a square, all the sides will be x. Okay? So, if you notice, when I drew the diagonal in the square right here, I just created two right triangles. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use Pythagorean Theorem to solve for x. So I'm going to go x squared, one of the legs, plus the other leg, x squared, and that's going to be equal to the hypotenuse, 11.3 squared. I'm using this right triangle right here. Okay, now, we got to understand how to do this. So remember, the x squareds have a 1 in front of them. That's called the coefficient. So 1x squared plus 1x squared turns out to be 2x squared. And that's going to be equal to 11.3 squared to the second power. So that's 127.69. Okay? Now I'm going to solve this problem for x. So I have to get rid of this 2 here. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. That would cancel out those 2's. And now my equation would be x squared is equal to, dividing 127.69 by 2, I get 63.845. And then, to solve for x, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. That would cancel out right there. And x is equal to the square root of 63.845. There's my gigantic calculator. Square root of 63.845 is equal to, and I'm going to round that would round to 8. Okay, that 9 would round that to a 0, but I have to round that up. So notice you get x is equal to 8. Now, that's not your answer, because remember the problem asked for what is the perimeter of the square. So to find the perimeter, we're going to add up all the sides. Well, if x is 8, that means all the sides are 8. So I'm going to go 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8, or you could have went 4 times 8. Either way, there's your answer. Perimeter is 32.